Hello, so we are in this Meet the Scholar Practitioner Global Leadership Series interview with Dr. Nyasha Cooper. And Dr. Cooper, she is an inspiration for a lot of scholars and practitioners like me who are interested in global leadership, cross-cultural leadership. Actually, she created this Meet the Scholar Practitioner Global Leadership Series interviews, and I was very fortunate that she thought that interview with me was going to be interesting, and she interviewed many other scholars and practitioners. And the rationale of this interview is that when she interviewed me, I thought, and who is interviewing you? Because again, you have been an inspiration for a lot of us in terms of global leadership, cross-cultural leadership. So that's why I thought it would be a good idea to interview you, because people they need to know your perspective and all your insights and knowledge. So that's a little bit the rationale of this interview, and I have the privilege of interviewing you for this wonderful series of videos that you created. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for beautifully pronouncing my surname. It's something that's very important to me. It's like music to my ears when I hear it pronounced correctly. And it's a way of honoring what it means. Guramatunu means to travel across lands. And so it fits well with the kind of work that I do and being interested in different global spaces. So thank you for honoring me with the correct pronunciation.
You are very welcome, and that means the destiny, it was your destiny to be doing what you are doing. Thank you very much. So I want to ask you, what is your current role at the university? What are your teaching and research interests, and the impact that you hope to have in the leadership field?
Absolutely. So I should start by saying that I've been a leadership educator since 2009, and it's hard to believe that I've been working in this space for that long. But I'm in an interesting transition right now. So I serve as an associate professor of leadership studies, but I'm currently moving from one institution to the other. So for the last 6 years, I've been working at Kennesaw State University, and I've been teaching there in a faculty role. And now I'm transitioning to Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas, where I'll be teaching in the Leadership Studies department, working with doctoral students who are pursuing their PhDs in leadership. So in terms of my role, I identify as an educator scholar. If I were to put a label to the kind of work that I do and the role that I play, that is it. I aim to be an educator scholar in various spaces, which means that I can change from institution to institution, but at my core, I'm still this individual who's interested in education as a practice and concept, but also asking questions, and that's where the scholarly piece comes in. In terms of my research interests, I actually discovered my research interest while I was at Gonzaga, where I earned my doctorate in leadership studies. And Gonzaga is an interesting place because the program is very enriching and rewarding from an individual perspective. And so here I was as a student, and I was embedded in this rich knowledge about leadership, particularly from a theoretical perspective. But what I found as I went through the program, and I'm very grateful for my experience in the program, I got to meet people like you, of course. But one of the things that I realized was that I didn't see my part of the world represented in the curriculum and the discussions. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and I navigate the world as an individual from Zimbabwe, from the global south. And so I'm always interested in seeing how my part of the world is seen as a place of knowledge production versus deficit. And so when I was a doctoral student, those are the questions that I had. I would always say, well, how does this concept apply to a Zimbabwean context? Or what would a Zimbabwean individual say about this topic that we're discussing? And because I didn't see that or didn't have the opportunity to really engage in that in my doctoral program, that was the moment that I decided that that is going to be my lane when it comes to leadership studies and leadership education. So that is really my research interest, looking at cultural and social contexts of leadership, ways of knowing and ways of being around the concept and practice of leadership, but also thinking about who is excluded or included when we talk about knowledge production as it pertains to leadership. And so for me, my affinity and my loyalty is to places like the Global South, like my own country, Zimbabwe, to see them as places that can, in fact, give rich understandings about what leadership is or is not, depending on where you are. I always say that where you are globally matters, because that is going to influence how you accept or reject theories about leadership as we know them. So the impact that I hope to make is that we see the world as in this vastness, we see it as a place to learn about leadership. So not just one corner of the world, but every part of the world has a role in stretching what our understanding of leadership is. I also believe that leadership moves the world positively or negatively. And so to understand the direction that we're going, we have to understand the spaces that we're engaging in. And so I am hopeful that through my work, I'm contributing to this idea of stretching what leadership means, but also how we practice it, and also how we question some of the things that we've taken for granted when it comes to the topic. So a very long answer, but that's because I'm very passionate about the work that I do.
And a fascinating answer, and that's why your work is fascinating, because we have this need. There's not a lot of research regarding global cross-cultural leadership. It's growing, but still we need more research. And what you were saying, the field research is very local from the US and has been imposed as universal. Mm-hmm. So we need to deconstruct this and then make visible other ways of leadership, leading, and your work is doing this. That's fascinating, and I appreciate it a lot. I'm very interested in culture, and again, your work has been very inspirational. Thank you. So my second question, you have all this passion and leadership studies, education since 2009, but if you were not a leadership scholar, an educator, what you would be doing?
In the last year or two, I've really been thinking about this question because I went straight from my undergraduate program to my master's program to my doctoral program without a break. So I haven't really thought about what else I would be doing. But now I know what I would be doing. I would actually be an interior designer. I enjoy creating an aesthetic. I enjoy details. I enjoy organization. I enjoy utilizing space in different ways than how we imagine it. So interior decoration would be something that I would be doing if I were not a professor.
And that's connected with research, environments, structures. So there's a connection there, and it's fascinating. Actually, that could be a good research paper. We can think about it.
Right. Add to our list of collaborations that we're going to do.
Thank you. What are the top qualities or characteristics that a leader must have to lead effectively in this global scenario? And if you can answer this question from this frame of head, heart, and hand.
Mm-hmm. So when I think of head, I think of the intellectual piece, but the word that comes to me is this idea of curiosity. And so that means that we are asking questions about our environment, as you alluded to, but also how we impact that environment and how it responds to us. And so curiosity about people, places, things, and events, I think is very, very important and crucial, because without that curiosity, we won't be able to develop the other skills that are needed to be effective within global spaces. So curiosity is number one. And then when it comes to the idea of heart, I'm going to borrow from the emotionally intelligent leadership model, which talks about consciousness of self, other, and context. And so the idea is being able to pivot between my understanding of myself, my understanding of the other, but also being mindful and curious about the context in which we're engaging. So from the head perspective, it's curiosity. From the heart perspective, it's emotional intelligence, specifically being able to move between self, other, other in context. Now, the difficulty in that is sometimes we are so comfortable with self that we forget about other in context, or sometimes we are mindful of other in context, but we forget about our own positionality and our standpoint. And so the idea then is to think, how do we operate functionally with all three operating at the same time? Self, other, and context. It's difficult to do. And even on my best day, I'm not operating in all three, but the goal is to try and to be mindful of when we're falling short. So that is an important aspect of that. And then in terms of the application piece or the hand piece, I think this is where we get to the idea of relationships. So I always like to think of that iceberg model that Edward Hall talks about in terms of culture, and the relationships are at the bottom of the iceberg, right? So getting to understand the limitations of my own knowledge, but also being curious and wanting to understand someone's positionality or the way that they experience a concept that I might think is universal, but it's actually a bit complicated when I get to understand their experience, as well as how they conceptualize a particular phenomenon. So this idea of building relationships is really, really important in terms of thriving in global spaces. And I think to be effective, we have to be thinking about thriving versus surviving. So I think to get to a place of thriving, which we can interpret as effectiveness, we have to be curious, we have to be emotionally intelligent, and we have to invest in building relationships within our global spaces. And that requires a measure of vulnerability. And being willing to fail up. And when I say fail up, meaning that when we have a misstep or a miscalculation, seeing that as a lesson. So how do we recover from those missteps and see that as an additional tool that we can add to how we navigate these different spaces? So it's very difficult to separate head, heart, and hand, because all three go hand in hand. But when I think of that, I think of curiosity, emotional intelligence, as well as relationship building.
This is you made a very, very good points, and particularly this idea of we have this tendency to separate and create these labels and categories to try to understand the complexity of the world. And the problem is when we forget that we created these categories and labels that separates reality. I really appreciate your point of this holistic, comprehensive perspective where everything is integrated. Head, heart, and hand, because I think this is how reality works, and particularly when we are talking about culture. I also like these ideas of cultural and intellectual humility. You have this curiosity, you have this, you want to establish these relationships to know more about other perspectives, and the emotional piece is key. So that's a wonderful answer. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would say it's really going back to where we started our relationship, Gonzaga, is that Jesuit way of thinking about a topic from a holistic perspective, and understanding that there are these pieces that come together to form our lived experiences or our realities that we engage in. And so I really appreciate that part of my narrative that exposed me to this kind of thinking, that I think is beneficial in many ways, whether we're in a corporate setting, in an academic setting, in a social setting, just thinking of things holistically and how can we come out of an experience whole rather than depleted or in pieces.
Exactly, I agree. The Jesuit education, this Ignatian pedagogy, this piece of flowing, of moving reality, it's a holistic. That I think that's key, and for everybody in life, but particularly for issues of global leadership. That's
Absolutely.
a great point. So, what about your personal experiences? Because you were born and raised in Zimbabwe. You came to the US. You have a lot of experience at a global level. What about this personal experience with your global leadership perspective? How they shaped, influenced your thought regarding global leadership, cross cultural leadership?
Absolutely. So I'll answer this question in two ways. I just recently sent my passport to be renewed, and it was full. I only got it in 2010, and I realized that in that short amount of time, just a decade, I had traveled to 32 different countries just on my American passport. And I mentioned that because all those travels to those different countries have really made me think about just how little I know about the world. So
Mhm.
each experience in travel made me really confront the limitations of my own knowledge, because I think sometimes we can get very confident about what we know, and then we think that that is the absolute in terms of how we know the world. But just traveling has made me realize how little I know, but how much more there is to learn. And so these travels have given me a spirit of learning, and an appreciation of learning, because each travel moment exposed me to things that I didn't know, or things that I thought I knew, and I have appreciated the learning that comes from that. And so, in terms of global leadership, I see it as it's not a destination. It's
Mhm.
the process where we take one step forward because we have a particular experience, and then we're thrust into a new context, which means we take two steps back because now we're reorienting. And so it's this movement back and forth where we accumulate experiences that add to our knowledge, but we're keenly aware or mindful of what that growth process looks like. So it's not a linear line, it's this
Mhm.
up and down. And I think that's the orientation that is going to be helpful in terms of thinking about global leadership. The other way that I'll answer the question is being from Zimbabwe,
Mhm.
and then I've lived in the US now for about 20 years, and then I also lived in Germany for 3 years. And I see myself as a bicultural individual.
Mhm.
And so, specifically, I identify as Zimbabwean American because that's how I navigate the world in that particular order. And so, there's this idea of being bicultural, or what Homi Bhabha, the culturalist, he refers to as third space or
Mhm.
cultural identity. And so I think global leadership is the accumulation of third spaces where we are mindful of the fact that we can have what is seemingly opposite share the same space. And so we have opportunities to create new cultures, new ways of knowing and being, honoring the spaces that we've come from, but
Mhm.
seeing the possibilities that might come about as we engage with people in other spaces. And so being bicultural and traveling has taught me to be comfortable with ambiguity and being comfortable with uncertainty, but also seeing uncertainty as a gift for lifelong learning. And I think global leadership requires this level of comfort with uncertainty, because you never know where your next lesson is coming from, and you never know where your next experience is coming from. So, this flexibility, this willingness to engage with the unknown, I think is a great tool and lesson for global leadership, because ultimately, global leadership is about possibilities. So, how do you engage possibilities if you are unwilling to engage the unknown?
Mhm. I think this capacity that you have proved because you have experienced it and learned throughout your lives, this capacity of navigating between cultures and worldviews, and this is a gift. And I think we need to emphasize more on this because you are focusing on the positive. You are learning from the experiences. You are not afraid of being vulnerable, and because this is the way of learning and developing resilience and this capacity for navigating this double or multiple consciousness. So this is a gift and it's fascinating, and when I met people like you with this capacity, I really learn a lot, and I think we should do it more because it's very important for our personal growth as leaders, and especially for global leaders. So I appreciate a lot these answers. Thank you.
Absolutely. I do want to say, though, that it's not easy, and I don't want to
Hmm.
make it sound easy. This, for me, has been a lifelong process of coming to these realizations. So, just because I'm saying it in a way that sounds easy, it definitely is not. And I also still have my missteps. I mean, I've lived in the US for 20 years, as I said, and I'm still learning about the culture. I'm still learning how to engage. I'm still learning how to build these third spaces. So the learning comes with a measure of reward, but also challenge. And so those two things come with this journey of global leadership.
Actually, there's this professor from the University of Barcelona, and he coined this concept called the Ulysses syndrome for immigrants, people who left their country and have been living in another country for so many years. When they go back to their country of origin, they feel that they don't fit
Yeah,
as they used to, and in their new country, they are still foreigners, so they are
absolutely.
navigating. So as you say, it's not easy, but it's what I say. You focus on the positive, on the rewarding, but obviously it's a difficult and tough process.
Absolutely.
So that was a good point that you clarify this. And as you say, you came to the US from Zimbabwe, uh, and in the middle you live in Germany. But do you think there's a Zimbabwe leadership? And if yes, if there's something similar to a Zimbabwe leadership, how it will look like?
That's a very good question. And I like the fact that you specify Zimbabwean leadership, because one of the things that we're guilty of as scholars and learners is thinking of Africa as a country rather than a continent. And so we ask, is there an African way of leadership? Well, of course there's not, because there are 54 different countries with different languages, cultures, traditions, and so forth. And so I think specificity is very, very important when we're talking about global leadership. So I don't use the term universality a lot, because I think depending on the part of the world that you're applying it to, it might actually erase the nuances that are actually represented in the term. So when it comes to Zimbabwean leadership, there are a couple of things that one would need to know. Zimbabwe was a British colony from 1890 up until 1980. So it's a relatively young country if you think of the Republic of Zimbabwe. And so that means that to understand Zimbabwe, you have to understand the history of colonization, particularly from the British Empire, but also how the post-colonial space looks like. So for Zimbabwe in particular, the historiography of the country is very much tied to conceptualization of leadership. So if you ask anyone in Zimbabwe right now, if you ask them to name leaders, they will name political leaders. And these particular political leaders are individuals who fought in the struggle for independence. For Zimbabwe to become an independent country, it had to have an actual war against the Rhodesian government, which was the colonial government, and that brought about independence in 1980. So the individuals who fought in that war are given a lot of deference as leaders. And so when we talk about leadership in Zimbabwe, for a lot of people, they associated with the war for liberation. And so individuals who fought in that war, particularly men, are immediately endowed with this title of leadership. And so in a lot of ways, within the Zimbabwean context, leadership is about positionality, and it's always about position, right? So you're endowed with a particular title, and the expectation is that you accept this title. So a lot of how we conceptualize leadership in Zimbabwe is tied to that particular history. In fact, we've seen that when people try to break onto the political scene, especially if they're young or if they're a woman, they have a hard time, because the national story is still that leaders are those individuals who fought in the war for liberation. So if you don't have those war credentials, it's very hard for you to break into the public leadership sphere. For example, there was a fantastic young lady, Fadzai Mahere, who is a lawyer, a very well-recognized lawyer in Zimbabwe, and she tried to run for parliament as an MP. But she couldn't because she didn't have those war credentials. And so even though we could see measurable actions, leadership actions that she had taken, she didn't have that one social credential that gave her license to walk into different spaces. And then there's this other lens about patriarchy in Zimbabwe, where that is a part of the culture. And so men and women arrive into leadership positions very differently. For women, they are expected to follow a certain paths that have to do with caretaking, paths that have to do
Mhm.
with performing labor and that sort of thing. Whereas for men, it's very easy for them to ascend to very visible leadership positions such as government, such as any position that you can think of, like a CEO or a minister. Those are paths that are very easy for men to take on because of how patriarchy is very prevalent within the culture. And so I think to think of leadership in Zimbabwe, I remember when I actually went to Zimbabwe to try and do a study on this, because I wasn't satisfied with the Globe study and other studies that claimed to have studied all these different cultural spaces. So when I was asking people, I interviewed over 300 people. And I would ask them, so what does leadership mean to you? And so I had to translate into the local language, which was
Mhm.
Shona that I was using. And in Shona, the word is mutungamiri, which means to lead, but it has a very specific connotation. It means the president. And so when I would say, how do you define leadership? They would say, oh, you mean the president.
Mhm.
And so you see that that national story is woven into individual spaces. And so there's very particular way of looking at leadership. And then if we look at, because the collectivist society, the family is also one of the structures that is the first space where people learn about leadership. And so the father is the head of the household, and that is seen replicated in the family structure all over.
Mhm.
And then you also have the chiefs of the village space. They are given preference and deference. You have what we call the headmen or sabbuku. They have this special position as well. So positional leadership is very much part and parcel of leadership in Zimbabwe. But when you look at our Western textbooks, we say, no, 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 don't discuss positional leadership. We want to talk about, all these other things. But there's a place for those theories, but sometimes they don't translate to our other spaces as readily or as easily as we want them to be. So when we think of Zimbabwean leadership, I'll close by saying we really have to understand the history of the country. And by understanding the history of the country, we understand that our Western ways of looking at leadership don't necessarily have a comfortable space within, at least in Zimbabwe. It's very hard to take the North House textbook and take it to Zimbabwe and say, this is what leadership looks like. I say all of this to say Zimbabwe is a very complicated country. And I think it's difficult to boil it down to one study or to say, uh, this is what is preferred. But I do know for a fact that leadership is really thought of in terms of the liberation struggle, but also in terms of political terms, which makes it easy, I guess, for some in political spaces to then say, well, leadership in Africa is only about politics, which is not true.
Mhm.
But that is the story that is most often told.
That's fascinating, explanation, and this is one of the big critiques to mainstream leadership theories, that they don't acknowledge the context.
Mhm.
And here, when it comes to context, the points that you were making, how language influences our conceptualizations of leadership, and particularly history, how history limits, constraints the emergence of leadership, and the examples that you were giving are fascinating. If you have this connection with this revolutionary movement for the independence, you are a leader, you have this symbolic power. Otherwise, you cannot be a leader. That's super fascinating. And it's an example how history influences leadership in a particular country. And in every country, we need to look more at the history and how we reproduce the leadership from that history, those heroes, those patriots, and sometimes we forget. So I love that explanation. Thank you. The history is fascinating, definitely. And we are gonna finish this wonderful conversation with a more pragmatic question, something for doctoral students. What advice do you have for doctoral students studying issues of global cross-cultural leadership?
Absolutely. So two words come to mind for me, and I think it's a really good time. It's always a good time to be studying leadership, but I
Mm,
think right now, where the discipline is, it's a really good time because we're focusing on this idea of criticality. And so when we think about global leadership, I would ask us to question what we mean by universal or what we mean by widely accepted. So we should be asking questions like, well, on whose authority is this universal? Who's included or excluded when you talk about these universal concepts? And when you talk about centrality, who is writing about these concepts? Are we guilty of committing what Fricker calls epistemic injustice, in the sense that we want to go to these spaces and ask about leadership experiences, but we don't either believe what people are saying in those spaces, or we try and translate it with our gaze or our lens. And so we end up reproducing these kinds of knowledge that don't honor the places that we're trying to study or trying to be a part of. And so I would say that criticality, as well as this idea of centrality, are really important to understanding global leadership. It's not just about 5 traits or these 10 things you need to do to be an effective global leader. I think we have to be asking these deep questions about knowledge production, about positionality, about some of the ways in which we either reify or that we actually commit harmful practices when it comes to knowledge production around global spaces. So it's a really interesting time for us to use qualitative ways to think about how some of these concepts are coming to us. So that ties into the idea of also recognizing the limits of our knowledge, this idea of cultural humility that we talked about
mm.
before, and curiosity. And that requires us to really recognize that we are still learning and we're in the learning process. And again, this is not a destination, it's a part of this lifelong process that we're all engaged in.
Mhm. That's beautiful and powerful, and you are bringing these ideas of power related with knowledge. And knowledge is it's not neutral. There are power issues there when it comes to create knowledge and what this knowledge is for, and who is gonna be benefit from this knowledge and the creation and so on. And what you were saying before, we cannot understand Zimbabwe leadership without acknowledging the colonial past, the asymmetries of power. So
Mhm.
this is a fascinating topic, and that's why those who try to learn more about this, we really appreciate your work. And before finishing, just you want to add something just to finish this interview, something that I didn't ask.
I am just excited about this kind of work. And as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot more interest in terms of global leadership as a concept. And we're seeing a lot more work that is steeped in cultural spaces. So I'm hoping that the next time that we have this conversation, we'll have a few more studies, a few more questions. And I hope that the way that we write our textbooks or the way that we teach global leadership, that this will become a part of the discipline and not just an add-on. My critique has always been that when we look at traditional leadership textbooks, culture is at the end of the textbook. And how can we understand leadership as a global phenomenon if we see culture as just an add-on thing that's at the periphery? And so I always say that authors should push that chapter about culture to the very beginning of the textbook, because how do we understand and reject theories if we don't do it from a place of cultural understanding? So whoever's thinking of writing the next great leadership textbook, I really implore them to be mindful of how culture influences how we learn about leadership, but also ultimately how we practice leadership within global spaces.
So, Dr. GuramatunhuCooper, that was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.